Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you a paid instructional video for an upcoming crowdfunding campaign, Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire. Now, to get all of the particulars about when and where you can back this expansion for Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift, look in the description below. All of that information will be there for you. Now, Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire is an expansion to the base game Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift Revised Edition. It is an advanced version intended for players who are familiar with the base game and its rules. Also, if you're not a fan of reading rules yourself, be sure to check out my How to Play series for the base game. There'll be links to that in the description and also probably in the cards for this video. The rulebook included with Soul Spire is a supplement to the base game rulebook. After reading through this rulebook, the included rules reference sheet should be sufficient for the majority of your plays. Soul Spire will be available in two different versions. An upgrade version for those who already own Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift or Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift Revised Edition, as well as a full game that can be played on its own, which will include bits and pieces from the Revised Edition and the first maps of the Revised Edition so that you can practice the base game with it, but it will not have all the content of the base game, just the components needed to learn it before you play Soul Spire. Now, of course, what you're seeing here today will be a prototype of Soul Spire, so keep that in mind. There will certainly be things that will be of higher quality when the final production copy is produced, and of course, things are subject to change as well, including the rules themselves. Though at this point, the rules are pretty well nailed down from what I've been told. Now, it is recommended that you be comfortable enough with the strategies of the Perdition's Mouth base game that you can play through the first two scenarios of the base game with relative ease. It's also not necessary to finish the base game campaign before starting Soul Spire, but doing so is recommended. The story of Soul Spire is intended to be experienced several times, since each time will be different due to the different scenario outcomes and player choices. There are three full story paths, each one seen from the standpoint of a single faction. The factions have very different worldviews and methods of resolving conflicts, but every time the heroes will be right in the middle of their activities. The three factions are the Frozen Court, the Grand Lodge, and the Collective. Each story path is divided into 3 acts. Each act has multiple scenarios, and each of the 3 factions has a unique story path. After the third act, the story path will conclude in either the hero's defeat or victory. As you work your way through Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire, it will be important not to read any of the nodes or scenario details and told specifically to do so. Each scenario will have one or more victory conditions, seen here, depending on which factions are present. This means that a scenario can end with a victory for one of the rival factions. If you don't like the outcome of the scenario, you may replay from the beginning of the story path. It's certainly possible that a hero may die while you're playing a scenario, and if that happens, you'll have 2 options. You may accept the death as collateral damage and play the rest of the campaign with that hero now being unavailable, or you can replay the entire story path. If you lose the guide and decide to continue the game, you'll need to refer to story node 667. There are 3 primary golden rules you should always keep in mind. If the text of a card contradicts a rule in the rulebook, the text of the card takes precedence. You'll be dealing with a lot of numeric values in the game. If you ever need to round the numeric value, always round it down. And if you do manage to find a conflict between the base game rules and the Soul Spire rules, assume that the base rules are correct. Players will associate themselves with one of the factions early on in the story based on their own actions. It also could be that, again, due to the actions of the players, the associations change. It is important to keep in mind that most choices require actions in the game that are consistent with the path the players are following. As we've mentioned, scenarios typically have several end conditions, and it could be that the condition triggered will signify a win for a faction the player is not siding with. Some heroes begin with a set allegiance, which is indicated by the faction symbol as you see on these 3 heroes. Heroes can lose an allegiance or gain a new one, but they may never hold more than 2 allegiances at any one time. Should they gain a third, they lose the first one acquired. This symbol indicates an independent alliance. Allegiances mean whenever an effect, rule, or plot detail refers to a faction, any hero with that allegiance is also affected. It's also important to realize a hero cannot simply choose to gain an allegiance. It is either pre-existing or awarded by the story as your choices are made. To begin the campaign setup, first you must choose your base group of 6 heroes for the opening scenario of Spire. This group of 6 heroes must include Sima, as well as the Guide, and then any 4 other heroes from Perdition's Mouth, Abyssal Rift, or its expansions. So, we could include Tyra, Bastion, Eliza, and Niffle. The Guide is from Spire. When choosing these 4 additional heroes, their starting faction allegiance is irrelevant. The Guide, as I said, is new to Spire, and it must be used in the first scenario. After that, it's up to you whether you use them or not. Eventually, you'll gain access to 2 additional heroes for each of the 3 playable factions, but this will be clear when the story indicates. Also, the heroes belonging to factions against whom you play will appear in some scenarios as enemies and/or neutral NPCs. Now, if you've played through previous Perdition's Mouth content, including Abyssal Rift and/or its expansions, you can continue the story of any surviving heroes in Spire. You'll keep their decks as they were at the conclusion of Abyssal Rift, including any accumulated treasure and wounds. If Sima died in that campaign, go ahead and resurrect him with no treasure and no wounds. If you don't have enough surviving heroes, resurrect enough to fill out the group to 6. If you have more than enough surviving heroes, you can include all of them. If you don't have a record of the surviving heroes and their decks, you can use this alternate starting setup. Choose Sima and at least 4 other heroes. Let's remove the Guide for now, since the Guide comes from Spire. Draw from the response deck until you've drawn 2 positive values. So there's a +1 and a +4. Add those 2 together and draw that many treasures. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, had I drawn any trap cards, I simply would discard that one for now and redraw it. Now, draw 2 more positives from the response deck. We have 5 again, and this will indicate the number of existing wound cards your heroes start with. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's some nasty ones in there. You now allocate these treasures and wounds to your heroes as you like, so long as no hero's wounds exceed his or her starting health points. Spire comes with 3 new cards for each hero. Add the 3 new cards for each hero to their existing cards to make a pool of cards for that hero. You'll then select a total of 14 cards from each hero's pool of cards to make that hero's deck. This deck will remain fixed throughout a scenario, but it can be altered or remade at the beginning of each scenario path. When changing the deck, if a hero still has wound cards in their deck, they keep those wounds. They may only change out the non-wound cards. It should also be mentioned that when setting up a new story path, if an event modified your hero deck during the previous story path, you may, if you wish, revert this change. The setup of each scenario is described in the storybook. It is strongly recommended not to read ahead. A scenario entry will provide information and instructions for at least the following. The map layout will include the use of the base map, side A or B, and cardboard pieces which are set up based on the example, this being the example. It will also list any cardboard pieces required. You can see here, this lists the map, the main elements of the map, map tokens. He goes on to list out spawn points and exits for heroes. We've got sigils and spawn pools. Each scenario will require a number of initiative cards, which will be listed here for the initiative deck. As in the base game, each scenario has models that are placed in play at the beginning of the scenario, as well as into the spawn pools. Unlike the base game, the starting position on the enemy Watchstone will be determined by the scenario. Also, in Spire, you will no longer be using a treasure deck, but rather each scenario will explain which items, powers, benefits, and boons can be acquired and how. It should also be noted that if at any time a scenario specifies components that are no longer available, ignore those resources and play without them. In each story path, you are allied with one of 3 factions. All models from that faction will be your allies. Your abilities will aid them and they will help you. You will also be able to choose heroes from this faction to join you in battle. All models of the opposing factions will be your enemies. However, they are also enemies to each other. Heroes from your own faction will be played similar to the base game, but heroes from opposing factions are driven by AI. Insectoids were allied with the Grand Lodge of the Change in the past. However, the demon that controlled them is gone now, and the insectoids are a common enemy of all factions in Spire. Most enemies belong to groups such as the Rotika, and their cards detail the abilities of all creatures of that type. A few, however, are unique, specific models. These are clearly marked with this unique symbol here. If a unique character is killed in a scenario, it cannot appear in any later scenarios in the campaign, even if the scenario sheet lists its ID. The graveyard box can be used to help you remember not to use dead, unique characters. In Spire, there are 3 sizes of characters or creatures indicated by this symbol here. In addition to large and small sizes, we now also have tiny sizes. Tiny creatures have the squeeze feature as an automatic effect. They may move through any model as long as they end their movement on an empty space. They cannot move through a closed door, but they can move through a closed portcullis. Also, as you might expect, tiny creatures will not trigger a pressure plate, and they cannot bash or push bigger creatures. In Spire, you of course have the large monsters like this, but you also have large heroes and NPCs. Basically, any unit that takes up more than 1 square will be considered large. Every large unit or hero automatically has the following traits and rules adjustments. Large models move in a similar way as described in Abyssal Rift. The only difference is that facing is added in Spire. Models controlled by the game will always end their movement facing their target. If that's not possible for any reason, then face the model as close as possible to its nearest enemy. Now, I don't have the models of any large player-controlled heroes currently with me, but just know that these heroes will choose their facing at the end of their movement. Finally, if a large model was ever forced to end its movement where it cannot expand to its full size, it would take 1 damage and stay in that 1 space until it performs another movement. This will never happen voluntarily. A large model will never voluntarily end in that sort of cramped space. Large models have Juggernaut, as we mentioned, which means that all terrain obstacles, costs, and penalties are reduced by 2 to a minimum of 0. So this space would be reduced to 1, this space to 0. It should be noted this does not mean that moving on clear terrain gives them extra movement. And it should be noted that insectoids still suffer no penalty for moving in difficult terrain, so this would actually have no effect on the Tharnics regardless. The facing of a large creature also affects attack and defense. Large minis generate threatened squares around them at 1 range from the mini, just like the normal size. And they have 3 facing categories. The front is +1 for attack and +1 for defense. The side follows standard rules. And for the rear, the large model cannot attack, and it receives -2 defense. These bonuses and penalties apply to any melee attacks regardless of range, but do not apply to any range attack. Just as a reminder, push, bash, banish, and other force movements only work on creatures of the same size or smaller. Also, all large creatures are considered the same size regardless of how many squares they actually occupy. It also should be noted that teleportation is magic and isn't constrained by the physical size. Any model may teleport any model regardless of size. In many ways, enemy and NPC heroes behave very similarly to normal enemies and allies. For instance, they will draw response cards for their attack and defense. However, in a scenario in which a hero is acting as an enemy or NPC, there is an additional step involved. The hero will draw 2 cards from their hero deck at the start of their turn and try to use these cards as advantageously as possible for their faction. Every NPC hero will have an initiative card, and on that initiative card will be an action priority. If a drawn card can be used according to that action priority, it will. On the other hand, if the hero card cannot be used according to the action priority, players can choose what is the most beneficial use of the hero cards. However, the general rule is that whenever the hero cards do have at least one possible use, that should be used. As with a player character, the NPC hero can use these cards for any of their own attack, defense, or other actions. However, when attacked or forced to defend, they can use these cards, but only before they draw a response card. Hero cards that are not used by the hero by the end of the round will still be discarded, and the hero deck in question is then shuffled in with the discarded cards. In all other aspects, NPC heroes act just like any other model not directly controlled by the players. Furthermore, NPC heroes follow the same rules for fatigue, curse, and wounds as any other model not directly controlled by the players. One of the major changes in Spire is the use of an initiative track to handle turn order and how that relates to the use of the enemy Watchstone. In Spire, there isn't a hero phase or enemy phase, and instead, heroes, enemies, and allies take their turns in the order determined by their initiative card. The order will be set at the beginning of each scenario and will remain fixed for the duration of the scenario unless changed by effects that explicitly indicate to change it. Turn order is set by placing the initiative cards on the initiative track along the lower and right edge of the board in the order described in the determining initiative section of the scenario. Once the last initiative card on the track has been resolved, the round ends and the end of round effects resolve. The initiative card for enemies and allies shows all the details necessary to automate that individual or group. The enemy sheets that were used in the Abyssal Rift base game are no longer needed. You can see we have hit points, attack value, defense value, range value, movement points, and movement rule, keywords, and if jump is a keyword, it will have the jump value. Any special abilities will be found in this section as well. The faction can be found in the top left corner. The size indicator is here. And if this were a unique model, it would have this icon here. Every initiative card has an ID number in the lower left corner, which is used in scenario descriptions to determine exactly which cards are used in that scenario. The lower right corner specifies the difficulty level of that particular enemy. This is to allow quick referencing of enemies and, if need be, to allow switching to an easier version of the enemy or a harder one. There are 8 types of initiative cards. Group initiative cards are cards that contain the stats and special abilities of a particular group of enemies. Hard and adventurer versions of a group with different descriptive names are still part of the same group. Unique model initiative cards contain the stats and special abilities of an individual enemy. They are usually shuffled into the initiative deck, but are sometimes placed on specific slots of the initiative track. This is a generic hero initiative card. For each player-controlled hero, use one of these initiative cards. These are not specific to any particular hero and can represent any player. When one of these is active, any hero who has not acted yet may now act. There will also be non-player hero initiative cards. These cards will contain the stats and special abilities of a particular hero. These cards will only be used when a hero character is acting as an NPC. This is a not in use initiative card. These cards are used to block an initiative card slot on the track, and out of use slot remains so for the whole scenario. A reserved initiative card is used to reserve initiative card slots as specified by the scenario. This is a spawn initiative card. These cards are placeholders for model types that are not presently on the game board but might appear later. Also, at the end of each round, if there's an initiative card on the initiative track that belongs to a model type that is neither on the board nor in any of the spawn pools, you should replace that card with a spawn initiative card. This makes space for new types to appear. And this is a delayed initiative card. These cards are for initiative cards that are not currently active, but count down the rounds until they are. Now, there are a number of steps to setting up the initiative deck, so I'm going to walk you through how to set up the initiative deck for scenario X1, which is the first scenario you'll encounter. The initiative track has 19 slots, with slot 19 always used for the end of round card. To begin setting up the initiative deck, take the initiative card for each enemy named in the supporting cast. So we've got Rotika, Raku, Guard, Acolyte, and Shocker. You'll then add one generic hero initiative card for each hero. We'll say we're playing with 2 heroes, so there we go. You'll then add not in use initiative cards equal to 6 minus the number of hero cards added. So we added 2 hero cards, which means we'll add 4 not in use cards. You would then add any enemy hero initiative cards to the scenario, but for this scenario, there are none. You'll now add any reserved, delayed, and further not in use initiative cards as the scenario specifies. In this case, there's no reserved cards, but there is 1 delayed card that should be added and 3 not in use cards. You'll now shuffle this deck of initiative cards and then deal them out randomly on the initiative track, unless of course it's specified differently by the scenario. This deck will always cover numbers 1 through 18. You should have exactly 18 cards in this deck every time you build it. And remember, space 19 always has this end of round card in it. If the scenario calls for a reserved initiative card, it will also explain under what conditions the reserved card should be replaced. If there is more than 1 reserved initiative card on the initiative track when the condition is met, players may choose which reserved card to replace. The scenario will sometimes instruct you to set up a delayed entry for 1 or more initiative cards. As you see here in X1, there is 1 delayed entry card. The setup instructions will typically indicate the delay time to be used in the format you see here, where you have 1 delayed initiative card, and then you have a number that follows it. That number indicates the number of round countdown markers you will need to put on it. You'll also see it indicates what enemy initiative card will be revealed when the delay is complete. So when this is dealt onto the initiative track, you would then place that card underneath it. Make sure you can, at minimum, see the faction symbol for that card. The delayed card itself counts as 1 delay, and so we'll place a 2 on top of it. Also, if a new initiative card is ever placed out on the initiative track for any reason, place a delayed card on top of it, as fresh initiative cards will always be delayed 1 round before it becomes active. Each round during the end of round, 1 delay is removed from each delayed card. Now let's talk about how the enemy Watchstone is used in Spire. Now keep in mind, normally there is that wheel that goes on top of these numbers. In this particular prototype, I don't have it, but that should be here. Whenever the first enemy for a round takes its turn, draw a response card. This response card is now used for all non-player initiative cards for the rest of the round. Every time a non-player initiative card is activated, you should move the green stone clockwise a number of steps based on this response card. So in this case, we'll move it 2 spaces total. Every time the green stone is moved onto a new action spoke, have all models of the currently activated type perform that action. If several models are activated, the individual models' activation order follow the base game instructions. If the response card has a value of 0, Perform the action on which it is currently placed. If the response card is a -1, move the green stone one step backward and perform that one action. After an enemy group finishes their actions, move the green stone on the enemy Watchstone back to where it was when it started. As many of the scenarios have map edges where there are no walls and or holes towards the bottom, there is a danger of falling. If someone is about to be forced over the edge, the model gets to draw a response card and check for this eye symbol. The outcome will depend on the model type. If the model is a hero or unique model, then they have saved themselves if they draw the eye symbol, and if there is no eye symbol, then they fall. If the model is a non-unique model and they draw the eye symbol, they fall, and if they do not draw it, they save themselves. If a model does save itself, they have managed to grab the edge before falling off. In this case, place the model lying down, and then they gain a fatigue. If the model does fall off, then check the scenario rules to see what falling down means. If it were a small hole and was small enough that the entire base of the creature could not fall through it, then they are able to walk over it. They treat it as 4 movement terrain. Flying models automatically ignore falling down checks. Certain spells and effects will cause enemies or heroes to fall unconscious. When a model is unconscious, lay the model on its side. A model will remain unconscious until attacked, whether or not the attack hits. At that time, stand the model back up. An unconscious hero receives no movement points, cannot take any actions on the Stone of Destiny, and cannot lend aid. Unconscious enemies do not take any actions on the enemy Watchstone and do not draw response cards when they are attacked. If a model has simply fallen prone but is not unconscious, they still take the same penalties but will stand up at their next activation. Jump is a new ability, seen here, that some models have and can use to move from platform to platform. Each jump ability gives a range value, in this case 2, which indicates how many spaces orthogonally the model can move in a single jump. So in this case, the model could move 2 spaces with a jump. Jumping allows the model to move across chasm spaces, but not through anything else that would block movement. To jump, the model makes a move action. Using the jump ability is done instead of normal movement. It takes the model's entire move action to perform the jump that turn, with no additional movement allowed either before or after the jump. A jumping figure is still subject to any failure penalties in the arrival square, just as walking would be, and is still affected by threatened squares. So Niffle has jump 3, which means he could jump directly across this chasm. But if he were next to an enemy, he would still have to take into account the fact that he is in a threatened square. A flying model ignores all terrain penalties for the squares it moves through, except for the starting and ending squares, whose terrain penalties apply as normal. So a flying creature can just move straight across like that, can move right through this terrain here, and it is also not blocked by other models, but the final space must be unoccupied. Also, for that first square of movement, the model must pay the normal cost for leaving a threatened square. Also, for the last square of movement, it must pay the full cost of entering that space. It also should be noted that flying over a space with a sigil does not trigger it. Flyers may end their movement in chasm squares. Flyers may never enter any out-of-bounds squares. In Soul Spire, treasures are never drawn, as we've mentioned, but instead rewarded at specific points in the campaign. Also, if the trap deck is to be used in a given scenario, its composition will be described in the scenario setup as you see here. So for the From the Well scenario, the trap deck will consist of Freeze, Curse, Drain, and Snare. Sigils are new map elements that players will find in the Soul Spire scenarios. The locations of these sigils will be marked on the map during setup. Some scenarios may even place two sigils in the same square, in which case they will be resolved together. There are 4 ways to deal with a sigil tile: activating, inspecting, hacking, and breaking. Activating is the direct, obvious interaction which takes place when a model enters the sigil square. Inspecting can be accomplished by any character with the machine skill. To do so, the character must be within range 1 of the sigil and spend 1 move to inspect it. Inspecting is automatically successful. Players should reference the scenario instructions to determine what the sigil does, but not actually activate it. A character can hack the sigil exactly the same as picking the lock of a treasure chest. As in the case of picking locks, this can only be done as part of a move action, and to do so, the character must be in range 1 of the sigil, draw 2 response cards, and then spend the number of movement indicated by the sum of those 2 response cards. Upon successfully hacking, the character may spend any movement that's left over. Finally, the sigil may be attacked and broken with brute force using the standard attacking rules. Use the same rules as if you were attacking a door. If broken, remove the sigil without activating it. There are several types of sigil tiles. They may represent traps. When activated, draw a card from the trap deck and apply its effects. These are one-use sigils unless the scenario specifically says otherwise. The sigils could represent a curse. When activated by a hero, draw a curse card from the curse deck and add it to the hero's deck following the rules for the wound cards. Non-unique models activating a curse will get fatigue instead. These are one-use sigils unless the scenario specifically says otherwise. If it's a bless sigil, the character receives the blessing token as per the base game rules. These are one-use sigils unless the scenario specifically says otherwise. The sigils may represent a pressure plate. Each pressure plate tile has a unique symbol on it, and that symbol will match a door on the map using them. Each scenario will define specifically how the pressure plates function. It should also be noted that tiny models cannot activate pressure plates. Sometimes a sigil will be empty, which means nothing happens. Sometimes a sigil will actually cure 1 fatigue of the model using it. These will be one-use sigils unless the scenario specifically says otherwise. Sometimes a sigil will teleport the figure using it. These teleport sigils may be one-use or permanent, and that will be described in the scenario. And then, of course, there will be scenario-specific sigils which will have specific uses defined by that specific scenario. Generally speaking, before playing any scenario, you will not know which sigil triggers which effect. When a sigil is encountered using any of the 4 methods we previously mentioned, you will draw 1 tile from the sigil bag to determine what the sigil represents. Once this is determined, all sigils of that color will be the same type for this scenario. The next scenario, or when you replay the same scenario again, they will be different, so you will have to determine them again with the same method of drawing the effects from the bag. Now let's discuss some updates to the actions from the base game. All models in Spire will move according to the movement priority rules found in the base game, with these exceptions. When moving, models do not only consider heroes as valid targets, but also all models which do not belong to their faction. It's also possible that a scenario will specify certain target priorities. These will always be the first priority for both attack and move actions when available. Also, it's important to keep in mind that no model may enter an out-of-bounds square. Attacking has been modified similarly to the movement rules. When attacking, models do not only consider heroes as valid targets, but also models of other factions. And again, some scenarios will specify certain target priorities. Spawning also works differently. The primary and secondary spawn pools are still used during the primary and secondary spawn actions, but the reserve pool is not used in Spire. In the base game, a spawning action will only happen once per round, but in Spire, it will be resolved multiple times for each enemy or NPC initiative card resolution whenever the spawning action occurs. Also included with Soul Spire will be 4 faction-specific spawn activity cards, which are basically indicators of a toggle mechanic to see whether a faction is allowed to spawn this turn or not. When the action marker reaches one of these spawning actions on the enemy Watchstone, follow this procedure, focusing only on the respective spawn pool. First, we check to see if the initiative card in question is a unique model. As you can see, it is. In that case, we will ignore the spawn action entirely. On the other hand, if the corresponding spawn pool, in this case the primary spawn pool, contains one or more models matching the initiative card, spawn exactly one model of that kind from the spawn pool. Spawning will then end for this initiative card. Now at this point, if you have not added any new models to the board, you will check to see if there are any spawn cards on the track. If there aren't, there's no room for another one currently, so there's no point looking any further, and spawning will end. Now, if there is a spawn card, then check if the spawn activity card for this faction is on its active side. If not, that's because this faction has already spawned, in which case spawning ends. But if there are initiative cards yet to enter the game for the same faction as the current initiative card, then choose one of these and replace a spawn card on the initiative track with that initiative card. And then, of course, place a delayed card on top of that initiative card. And then flip the faction's spawn activity card to its inactive side. Spawning will then end. Finally, you'll move along the initiative track as normal and repeat the process when the next group enemy initiative card activates. The places where models spawn are similar to the base game, so insectoids spawn by nests. Other models will spawn at faction-specific entry points as listed in the scenario description. There are cardboard tokens provided to mark those places on the board. Just as for the base game, you'll place a model adjacent to the faction-specific entry point. And if this was not possible, then you could place them diagonally. And if still not possible, then you could place them directly on the entry point. And if this was not possible, then you could place them diagonally. And if somehow that still was not possible, you could place them directly on the entry point. In some scenarios, the entry point may be defined as a collection of squares, or there may be more than one entry point. In that case, players choose which squares and/or entry points to use. At the end of each round, you will need to update the status of the game by following a few quick steps, which are summarized on this end of round card that will always be in slot 19 of the initiative track. First, check for victory conditions. Have the heroes or any of the factions achieved their goal as specified by the scenario? Some scenarios cannot actually be lost, and it is simply a matter of which faction wins. Second, check the losing conditions. Have the heroes failed? The scenario will specify how the scenario could end in this way. Third, perform any end-of-round effects from cards. Fourth, you'll move both enemy Watchstones. If you have just resolved any enemy hero end-of-round actions, move both stones according to the response card just used. Fifth, you'll clean up the initiative track. Remove any initiative cards that do not have a matching model currently on the board or in the spawn pool, and replace each of them with a spawn card to open up a slot for future spawns. Also check the initiative track for each faction that has one or more initiative cards with a delay of exactly 1. Flip the relevant faction's spawn activity card to inactive, and for all other factions, flip theirs to active. Number 6, you'll recover, meaning remove all feat and blindness effects. Number 7, you'll check for scenario-specific timed effects. These are often used by a scenario to introduce new features or enemies at certain points. Number 8, you'll clean up any tokens, such as discarding all attack, defense, or other tokens with a duration of 1 turn. 9th, you'll reset the hero shields, meaning you turn them pointing outward. And finally, for any cards on the initiative track that have a delay, you will remove 1 delay from them. Meaning, if it's only the card will be removed. And if the scenario requires a round count, you'll increase the round count by 1. Now let's discuss some faction-specific modifications. There are 3 faction-based deck of cards: Dwarven Innovations, Blessings of Change, and Gifts of the Fae. These cards include curses, blessings, spells, and gifts, and can be playable like hero cards, treasures, or items placed in the backpack slot. On some occasions, a specific card is named as a benefit of an action. If that card is not available, then heroes gain nothing. It should be noted that area of effect attacks follow the rules explained on page 24 of the Perdition's Mouth Revised Edition rulebook, with the slight addition that no AoE effect can extend into an out-of-bounds square. It's also important to keep in mind that multiples of the same area of effect attack does not stack. However, different AoE effects can be applied to the same square, and that square will be affected by all of them. If 2 or more similar effects apply to the same square, use the stronger effect and ignore the lesser ones. Blindness severely hampers attack and movement. When a model is blinded, mark it with this blind marker, placing the marker either on their initiative card for a unique card or next to the model on the map. When a blinded model attacks beyond range 1, adjust the accuracy of the attack by drawing a response card and checking the ballistic attack accuracy table. Any dud, explosion, or jammed result is a miss. Also, when a blinded model moves, add +1 movement point to every move. Blindness will be automatically cured at the end of the round. Out of Bounds adds to the main Perdition's Mouth line of sight rule set. There are crystal boundary squares and these gray squares beyond them. Any gray square, or anywhere that the crystal reaches at least to the center of the square it's in, are floor-to-ceiling walls and are considered out of bounds. Out of bounds squares cannot ever be entered, and they block line of sight for any kind of targeting, including ballistic. Flyers may not fly through out-of-bounds squares, but a figure may teleport through out-of-bounds squares, providing they do not end the teleport in an actual out-of-bounds square. Some weapons and effects are identified as ballistic. These are mostly area effect weapons able to target the middle of a crowd of enemies. Due to the trajectory of the projectile, they have targeting rules as follows. They cannot target range 1 or 0. They do not require a line of sight. They cannot shoot across walls, through slits, doors, portcullises, or anything similar. They cannot fire into out-of-bounds squares. And they do not have guaranteed hits. When resolving a ballistic effect, choose any intended target square, whether or not it has an enemy in it. Empty squares are valid targets. Then draw a response card to see how to resolve the effect on the Ballistic Weapons table. Finally, a flammable object creates a fire if it is successfully attacked. It has 0 defense and adds 1 response card. If the attack succeeds, the fire ignites and behaves as a fireball attack. If the attack fails, then the object remains intact. This is a burning square, and ending movement in a burning square inflicts +1 damage. Moving in or out of a burning square costs 2 movement points. And that is how to play Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire. Be sure to check the description for all of the information you need to be able to back Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire. And be sure to check back on the channel for a preview of Perdition's Mouth Soul Spire as well. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.